The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
And I realize my story is a gift because in most cases, not every, but in most cases, it's probably more extreme than the person I'm talking to. And yet I found richness and another side, a redemptive conclusion to that strange journey out of that subculture.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. I started reading Philip Yancey in the 1980s. In the decade since, he's written more than 25 books, including What's So Amazing About Grace, Disappointment with God, Where Is God When It Hurts, and The Jesus I Never Knew. Philip Yancey is a writer who starts with genuine questions instead of pat answers. He has said, I write books for myself. My books are a process of exploration and investigation of things I wonder about and worry about. His most recent book from 2021 is the memoir Where the Light Fell. It's a gripping story that starts with family dysfunction and religious dysfunction and moves toward the light and freedom of grace. It's the story of how Philip Yancey came to love God out of gratitude rather than fear. I was mighty glad when he agreed to talk to me for the Habit Podcast. Philip Yancey, I am so grateful that you've made time to be on the Habit Podcast today.
Well, it's good to be with you. It's a cold, snowy day here in Colorado, and nothing warms my heart more than talking to other writers.
Well, great. Yeah, it's a snowy day here in Nashville, too. I first was exposed to your work in the 1980s. I read Fearfully, Wonderfully Made and just loved it, and got the mistaken impression that you were a doctor. I was confused about that for a long time. In fact, I loved that book so much that for a little while in college, I did the pre-med track because I wanted to be a doctor just like Philip Yancey.
Well, I felt like I learned so much about the human body that I could practice, but I couldn't get anybody to let me practice surgery on them anyway.
Yeah. Well, I visited sort of sat in on a surgery and realized this is not for me. Philip Yancey can be a doctor, but not me. And then when you kept cranking out books, I thought, how does this guy have time to write all these books and also be a surgeon? And then I realized that you weren't the surgeon in that book. So
that's right.
Well, all of your books have been about suffering and grace. Mm-hmm. And you use anecdotes from your life throughout all these books you've written. But now you have written a memoir.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious to know why a memoir? What made you decide after this long career of writing on these themes, why did you decide to do a memoir this time?
I have been planning this for a long time. I realized, part of it goes back to conversations with Frederick Buechner, who is a friend as well as a writing mentor. And he wrote a book called Listen to Your Life. And that was his theme. And he had quite a life, which was shadowed by his father's suicide. And he never wrote about it for several decades out of fear of what it would do to his family, especially his mother. Yeah. And then finally he decided, this is my life. It's part of who I am. I need to face into it and include it in my writing. Well, I had several incidents that are along that line. There was not a suicide involved, but dramatic incidents. And I realized that I have been given a gift. Didn't feel like a gift when I was experiencing it, but the gift is that I grew up in a rather extreme toxic family, and I grew up in a rather extreme toxic church. And those are the background, that's the material that out of which I wrote a couple dozen books, but I had never really claimed that life and explored it. And for myself, discovered how that experience went on to inform and work itself out in my writing. So I did it, I write all of my books for myself, trying to figure something out. I joke that if I don't know the answer to a question, I write a book about it because it gives me a chance to go to people who do have some answers and to spend the time that I need. And so I'm over 70 years old now, and I decided, while my mind is still working, I need to go back and write what turned out to be a prequel that explains some of the very different idea-driven books that I've been doing for 40 years.
Yeah. I was so interested in that idea that, because you write that in your book, that this is a prequel to all those other books. I found it fascinating, that you say you grew up in a toxic home, toxic church. One is tempted to summarize it as a movement from legalism to grace, but to call your growing up, legalism is almost not fair to legalists. I mean, it was more than that, right?
I got a good dose, and frankly, one of my main goals years ago was I'd like to capture the subculture, that evangelical / fundamentalist subculture. In my case, pretty extreme, because it was mixed in with some angry people, a lot of institutional racism and things like that. Yeah. And we're living in a time when a lot of people are ditching the church for various reasons. I've heard there may be as many as 25 to 30 million ex-evangelicals. These are people who are raised in the subculture and maybe had some good experiences at a summer camp or Young Life or Youth for Christ Club. And yet something happened along the way to turn them off, whether it was how the church treated science or divorced people or gay people or whatever. When you talk to them, they all have these experiences of running into judgment and un-Jesus-like attitudes from the church. Yeah. So I listen to them and I say, let me tell you, it's a lot worse than that. Well, wait a minute. I thought you were a Christian writer. Yeah. Well, I am, but let me tell you my story. And even coming out of that environment, it can be useful. Don't throw away everything. Don't throw away the baby with the bathwater. Don't forfeit a chance to connect on a daily basis with the God of the universe because of the way some crank treated you 20 years ago. And I realized my story is a gift because in most cases, not every, but in most cases, it's probably more extreme than the person I'm talking to. And yet I found richness and a another side, a redemptive conclusion to that strange journey out of that subculture.
Yeah. You said that your nephew once sent you a quote that said, "An idea cannot be responsible for those who claim to believe in it."
Right. And I interpret that as don't blame God for the church, and don't judge God by the church.
Yeah.
We have to go through that sorting out process, because when you're a kid growing up, you tend to believe what people around you say. So I was a racist. I was a legalist. And then when you find out, well, they were wrong about some things, it feels like betrayal. Mm-hmm. And you go through this process of sorting out what's worth keeping, what's worth throwing away.
Yeah. A recurring theme in this book is sorting out what's real and what's fake. You and your brother, Marshall, working through those questions together in parallel. I'm not sure what the right spatial metaphor there is, but your brother sort of reached some different conclusions, or dealt with that difficult childhood in different ways from you. And I'm really interested in the idea. At one point, you say that as you write, you often imagine your brother, on your shoulder or behind your shoulder or whatever, saying, "Are you sure you mean this? Are you sure this is true? Are you just sort of spouting the same propaganda that we got when we were kids?" Questions like that. I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit, if you have.
Sure. We grew up in a completely church-saturated, religion-saturated environment. In fact, high school years we spent living in a trailer just 8 feet wide, 48 feet long, on church property. So we could never get away from church. Every time the doors were open, we were there. Plus, my mother made her living as a Bible club teacher. So even before school, we would be dragged around Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, hearing the same Bible stories every day. And it was a good way to learn the Bible, but we also learned the behavior. We learned how to pray in a way to bring tears to your eyes. We learned how to give testimonies. We learned how to go forward and confess sin or accept Jesus as our Savior. And we did all that multiple times. That was the environment that we soaked up. And once you've done that statement you made really comes from my brother and haunts me. How do you tell what's real from what's fake? Because you've done the fake stuff so long. How would you know if something real came along? And that's what I deal with in the book. And for people who have grown up in a toxic environment like that, to survive it, you usually have to choose something that's not particularly healthy. And we chose very different responses. My brother decided, I'm going to be the opposite of everything I was taught. Yeah. So they had all these rules. I'm going to break every one of those rules, and I'm going to break rules they haven't even thought of yet. And he did. So he dropped out of college, forfeited a brilliant career in music, started taking LSD, moved to California, lived with a bunch of different women, experimented with all kinds of sexuality, and got addicted to several substances along the way. Well, that's one way. And I watched my brother, he's 2 years older, and realized that's not a very healthy response. He's the one who suffers because of that. Those were self-destructive choices. My own way was kind of what I call turtling down, to build a shell around myself so that those people couldn't get to me, so that there's nothing they could do to get inside me, to protect myself and get through. And that involved trying to conquer pain and doing these things. And kids do that. There's a whole self-harming subculture, and it's very unhealthy. But sometimes to survive unhealth, you reach for unhealth, and it'll get you through. And I would say to kids who are going through that now, you're not going to stay there. You're not going to be there the rest of your life. Be careful. Don't hurt yourself, but try to survive until you can emerge, and try to emerge as intact as you can. Because you're vulnerable when you're a kid. Don't let them get to you. You preserve something in the core that you can come back and later nourish.
Yeah. You talk about this idea of turtling down, of closing yourself off to, emotional life, to the world around you. And your story of conversion, after conversion from ungrace to grace, is the story of opening up. And it seems to me, I have so many thoughts swirling around your conversion story. So I'd love to sort of dig into that a little bit. But the way you open up spiritually, and as you say, you are in the midst of Bible college. You, even though you're sort of in rebellion against what was going on at the Bible college, then you're faced with natural beauty, and you're faced with music, and you're faced with romantic love, and it's sort of, you start to see the world as a smiling place. As you said, are you quoting Augustine there?
Yes,
see the smiling place?
That is Augustine, and in fact, the book title, the memoir title, is "Where the Light Fell," and that's also from Augustine, who said, "I could not look at the sun directly, but I could look on where the light fell." And in my case, I would change that a little bit. I couldn't look at the sun directly because I had been scorched by the sun. I grew up with this angry bully God image, and didn't want to have anything to do with that kind of God. And it was only where the light fell, the things you mentioned, nature, classical music, romantic love, that I realized my church had misrepresented that God. That the one, the creator, responsible for those good things, the dona bona, as Augustine said, the good things in this world, that is someone I want to know. I love that quote from G.K. Chesterton. I think he stole it from somebody, but he often used it. He said, "The worst moment for an atheist is when he feels a profound sense of gratitude and has no one to thank." And I had thankfulness, and I had no one to thank. And then I realized, God is responsible for these good things. God isn't that creature, that angry policeman, cosmic policeman that I was raised believing in.
And that also seems to me prepares you to be a writer too, right? I mean, I know you had skills, writing skills before that. You write in your book about, you had done journalism, that kind of thing. But it seems to me that that same opening to the world, to creation, that led to your actually receiving the God of grace in Christ, was also what made it, made you ready to be a writer. Is that fair to say?
It is fair. Of course, I didn't know that at the time, because I didn't. When you're growing up, you don't know what you're going to be. But that suspicious, on the edge, marginal observer stance is good for a writer. Because you're not really living; you're watching. We writers are. Annie Dillard, who's a wonderful writer, said the reason writers write so much about their childhood is because that's the only time they ever really lived. The rest of the time they're kind of leeching off of other people's experiences.
Oh, wow.
And I, at first I saw my family as this collection of misanthropes and sociopaths, and then I began to see them as great material. You can't invent these things. You just can't make them up. And writers do that. They take what to everybody else is stuff to throw away and try to make something worthwhile out of it, something lasting.
I know. You said earlier, this you came to see this life of yours as a gift.
It is, and that being open and awakened to the sensory world, that was new to me. The nature, the music, and all that, and writing is an odd combination of creating and exploring that sensory world in the most boring circumstances possible. because you're sitting in an office. If there's anything going on that's beautiful, it's distracting. You got to get rid of that. So, mostly we have, we're looking at our offices right now. They're surrounded by books, not plants and animals and things like that. And so we're living in this pretty monastic, austere environment, but trying to create something that provokes a sensory experience in the reader.
Yeah.
It's an odd combination. No wonder. I read one time that of all professions, writers are the most likely to become addicted to smoking, cigarettes, and alcohol. Of course, we know stories of alcoholic writers. And I think part of that is just you're in the sensory deprived environment, and it feels unnatural, even though you're working to create one for somebody else. So your body is craving, give me something to do rather than just sit here clicking inset clicks on my computer keyboard,
Yeah, right. Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the idea that when you have a question, you write a book about it. And you're being a little facetious, but that's also a posture, it seems to me, that until you move from ungrace to grace, you can't do that as a writer. Right? You can't say, I've got a question and now I'm going to go pursue the answer. You have to start with an answer and then write to that answer. Mm-hmm. The floor is now open for comment.
Yes. When you go into a Christian bookstore, and there aren't many left,
right.
But when you go into one, most of the bestsellers for sure, are written by people who are experts in some way. Many of them would be well-known pastors, Chuck Swindoll or Max Lucado, or professors at a seminary. Here's a commentary on Romans, or things like that. And I read those people. I buy their books. That's how I learn. But I'm not one of those people. I'm not ordained, and I'm not a professor. I am a journalist. That's how I got my start. My only job really was working as a journalist for Campus Life magazine, and I've written hundreds and hundreds of freelance articles and then books after that. And a journalist starts usually with a question and an assignment to explore something he doesn't know where it's going to go.
Yeah.
Or she doesn't. If some magazine hired me and said, Philip, how do you put together a nuclear bomb? I have no idea. Yeah. But that's my job, to go find out how to do that and to express it in such a way that my readers, who know even less about it than I do, can say, oh, that's how you put together a nuclear bomb. Hopefully it doesn't get published in Iran or somewhere like that. But anyway, we take complex topics and represent the reader in trying to understand them. We're not telling the reader, here's something I know you don't know. We're saying, let's join hands and explore this topic, and maybe by the time we come out the other side, we'll have some insight that we didn't when we started. And that is my natural stance. It's not an expert talking down, this is what you need to learn. Because of my background, I learned to be rather distrustful of those authority figures, because they were telling me things I later found out were not true. Yeah. And so I wanted a different approach. I wanted that explore together from the bottom up rather than the top down approach.
Yeah. Speaking of, we've touched some on your experience, your conversion from ungrace to grace when you were in Bible college. And that process involved you re-envisioning, and I don't know what the right verb is, the story of the parable of the Samaritan. And, I grew up in church, and I heard all about the story of the Samaritan. It was always, don't be like the three guys who walked past the man broken on the side of the road. Be like the Good Samaritan, which was, I think, the way you got that story. And your moment of really coming to Christ very much was connected with you seeing that almost a visionary look at that story in which you realize you're neither the three guys who walked past the man broken on the road, nor are you the Samaritan. You are the man broken on the side of the road, and the Samaritan helping that man is Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this, what's the question? Do you have any insight on how you got to a place where you were able to not throw away that story, but understand that story in a new way that you've spoken about your suspicion of the authorities. Here was a moment in which you experience that story, and it makes a difference in your life, and there's something. It's a matter of you getting free of the authorities that have interpreted that story for you before.
Right. I talked about the difficulty of distinguishing the fake from the real.
Yeah.
And I had turtled down. I had been pretty impervious to the environment around me. I was at a Bible college, which is another story. How did I end up there? But I wasn't your ideal student. Quite the opposite. I would read magazines in chapel. I would sit out in the patio and read books like Why I Am Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell. I was just kind of a jerk.
Yes, a little obnoxious.
Yeah. And always on the dean's prayer list, what should we kick the student out? Is he polluting other students? And of course, I thought myself superior. These smiley-faced Bible college students who believe all this stuff, and I'm sophisticated. I can see things they can't see. Yeah. And then I was softened by the things that we mentioned earlier. The light was falling on those places. But again, how do I tell what's fake and what's real? And I had a revelation, I suppose would be the safest word to say, that was completely unexpected. That came out of nowhere. And I think I required that at the time. Mm-hmm. It was one of the few that there were two things that happened to me that I didn't have control of in that time of life. One was falling in love. I didn't even believe in romantic love. I thought it was an invention of the 14th century. And then boom, there I was in love. And then this experience, and I've not written in detail about it in 40 years, because as soon as you do that, people will say, well, I didn't have an experience like that. Yeah, right. Well, you're right. God deals with us differently. And I think God understood I needed something that I didn't concoct, that I didn't control, something that came from nowhere. Mm-hmm. And so I was in this prayer meeting, and I had never prayed there. It was a group of us who would go to university. They would evangelize. They would go and talk about Jesus to university students. I would sit in the student center and watch basketball games, and then we would have this prayer meeting, and they would each take turns praying and wait 5 seconds for me, and I never prayed. So they would say amen and take off. And they were my friends. They accepted my apostate self. And then one day I started praying. And as I started praying, this revelation of the Good Samaritan parable came to me. And the twist, the projection there, was that it was obvious that I saw that I understood myself to be the tramp in the ditch. Here I thought I was morally superior and sophisticated and all that. And instead, I was the neediest one of all. And then the face of the Samaritan was transposed with the face of Jesus. And Jesus kept reaching down, trying to help me. And each time I would spit in his face. And it was just a stunning insight to who I was. I thought I had it all together, but actually I was the neediest one. And that is the beginning of grace. Henry Nouwen used to say, grace is a free gift of God. Nothing you can do to earn it or deserve it. But to receive a gift, you've got to have your hands open. And my hands had been closed tight in a fist, and grace would just fall to the ground around me. I never received it. And suddenly I realized I was the one with the needy hands. Open them up and take it from there. And that changed everything. I went from a from a jerk, from a renegade on that campus to someone who eventually became a Christian writer. I would have thrown up if you predicted that at the time, but there it was. God has a sense of humor and a great sense of compassion as well. He dealt with me very tenderly, the tender mercies of God.
Yeah. One of your concerns in even doing this memoir at all was the concern that you would open up old wounds, that you would hurt people from your life, people you loved. How did you push through? I mean, you're talking about the Bible college. There was a at one point, as you say, you had a conversation with the president or the former president who said, "Why did you say these things about us?" And I know all kinds of dirt on people, but I practice the golden rule, and I don't say the things that I wouldn't want them to say about me. How or why did you push through those concerns? And because some people come out looking pretty bad in this memoir that you've written.
They do. And when I thought about that statement that the Bible College president made, I believe in the golden rule. I too believe in the golden rule. And actually, if I am off the rails, I want somebody to correct me. I want somebody to call me on it. And yes, I have hurt some people along the way, but it also helped some people along the way, because there are a lot of people who are trapped in toxic environments, a little bit different than mine, but toxic environments, and they need somebody to say, you know what, you're not going to hell just because you took one sip of wine. There's more to life than a series of rules. In fact, as Jesus demonstrated with the Pharisees, often it's the rule keepers who are most likely to miss the message of grace, the gospel of grace. And so I've got a constituency out there who are trapped in similar environments to what I grew up in, and I have a responsibility to them as well. The other thing that's happened, to my surprise, is that the people I thought I would really hurt have not been hurt. In fact, my brother loves the book, gives it away, feels like it validates him as a human being.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. And my mother can't read it. She's got macular degeneration, so she can't really read. But having some of these things surface has brought about a remarkable, I wouldn't say reconciliation, but at least steps toward that. They had not heard each other's voice for 51 years. And since I turned in the book manuscript, we've been on the phone, a 3-way phone conversation 3 times.
Really?
And are working toward forgiveness, or as close as we can get. And I would never have predicted that. I waited for years because I was afraid I would rupture things further. And exactly the opposite has happened. So that's been a kind of grace that I didn't expect, and comforts me a lot.
That's so great to hear. And you're talking about rupture between your mother and your brother.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
I, having read the book, I am so happy to hear that, because I didn't get the impression that was going to be possible.
The most amazing thing of all is that my brother wrote a card that had 3 words on it and mailed it to my mother. It's not easy for him to write. He's stroke afflicted, so he has to use his left hand, which is not his normal hand, and just stuffing an envelope and putting a stamp on it. These are hard things for a stroke victim to do.
Yeah.
And the card had 3 words: "I forgive you."
Wow. Which
I never would have predicted to happen. So that was an unexpected grace that came even after the book and calmed my fears greatly.
Oh, thank you for telling me that. I'm so glad about this. Because I've been worried about your family. Your mother doesn't read any of your books, is that right?
That's right.
Now she can't, but even when she could, she didn't read your books. Is that
correct? Yes. I think she might have skimmed through them just to see if I wrote anything about her or something like that, but she doesn't claim to have read them.
How do you feel about that? If you don't mind
probably relieved, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, no. I said one time, it's sad, Mother, that neither Marshall or I ever felt any kind of a sense of blessing from you. I was just reading in Genesis about the Old Testament, Isaac giving Jacob the blessing, and Jacob, this was so important, he would cheat and find a way to get it when it was actually due to his brother Esau. And neither one of us got it. Here's a guy who's trying to break every rule in the book. He didn't get the blessing. And here's a guy who makes his living as a Christian author, and he didn't get the blessing either. and neither did she. She came up with a family. And I think one key to understanding difficult families is just look back to how they were raised. And usually it's worse. It's worse off. I keep thinking if every generation learns what the previous generation did wrong, why aren't we better at it now? But it's human. It's just a broken world we live in.
Yeah. Well, writing a memoir is very much a function of transposing identity into, written form, word form. I mean, we have this inchoate sense of who we are, and then you start trying to put it into words, and things happen. I'm interested to know, are there ways that your sense of self was shaped by the act of putting your identity, yourself, into words?
Very much so. At one point, I call it a verbal selfie because there's one person in the foreground, and in earlier drafts, I just wrote down everything I could remember, and it was 2.5 times longer than the book turned out to be, because I brought in all of these characters from my family. And wise editor said, you're right, they are eccentric, they're very interesting, they should be in novels, but this is a memoir about you, so make that your requirement before including them in this book. But I, in a sense, I didn't know what that selfie would turn out to be. I mentioned that it was like doing a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle with no picture on the cover to guide you. So you have these little puzzle pieces with funny edges, and you, every once in a while you find how one fits into the other, but you don't know how it's going to result until the end. And you started by saying, I write about suffering and grace. Well, I only realized that in the process of going back and see the things that I've written in the person that I am, where I came from. And now I can understand, oh, no wonder you write about suffering, because you went through a lot of suffering. Yeah. In fact, when you were 1 year old with no memory of this, your father died because of a theological error, because of a mistake people made. And that did a lot to set the circumstances of your life from then on. And grace, I lived in an atmosphere I call ungrace. It was just, I never experienced grace. It was all trying to get God to like me. And it doesn't work. You'll never do it that way. Jesus was clear about that. So even though I had approached books like The Jesus I Never Knew, What's Amazing About Grace, just trying to come to terms with it, I was really trying to work out in print stuff that had been boiling at a low level inside since childhood. How can you put together the kind of people in some of these uptight churches, especially like a racist church, with a person like Jesus? How did that happen? And these are questions that in many ways were subliminal. Well, writing is a good way to bring out subliminal stuff, because you're sitting there just staring at a computer screen or a blank sheet of paper. And it's like going to a therapy session, and you're asking the questions and giving the answers at the same time.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great way to put it. Are you saying until you wrote this book, you had never put it together that the recurring themes in all your books are suffering and grace?
Almost. I was working on the memoir at the time, and funny story. And I was asked to speak at the University of Virginia. And I hate this, but when you agree to speak somewhere, they want to know a title right away. Well, I don't know what I'm going to speak about a year from now. You know?
Right.
So I always come up with something very generic, and said, we're publishing this brochure. We've got to have a title. I said, okay, 2 themes that haunt me. Oh, that's great. They wrote 2 themes that haunt me. And then as time got closer, I got to come up with 2 themes here.
2 themes that are haunting me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was working on the memoir, and so it just became clear this is what it is, and
interesting.
Those are the themes I spoke about.
Yeah, I don't know quite how to talk about this, but there's when you write a memoir, there's so you're offering up these facts and you're offering interpretations of those facts. And your reader is also getting the facts, and the reader is also interpreting those facts. And sometimes that comes into there's some tension there. And in the negative sense, I've listened to some for some reason, Audible gives these if you subscribe to Audible, you get these free stories or whatever. And I've listened to a couple of celebrity stories recently, celebrity autobiographies from celebrities who didn't have good reputations, and their explanation for their bad behavior. It's always interesting to think about that, the tension between their interpretation of their behavior or the facts on the ground and the way they've been portrayed. And then as a reader, it's sort of triangulating around these facts. All 3 of us seem to have different, sometimes I find it hard to accept the interpretation of the memoirist. And I was so interested as I was reading yours, and you are, as you're telling the facts of, say, your teenagehood, and you are not, as a child, I get the impression you didn't see yourself as anything all that special. And then it's like, whoa, there were 6 kids chosen to participate at the CDC, and lo and behold, I was one of them. And then, this counselor told me I was up for valedictorian. And I guess what I'm saying is I read these facts and I say, this was obviously a remarkable kid who didn't necessarily think of himself as remarkable. And again, I don't know, this isn't even a question. This is,
no, I know what you're saying. And I had never written a memoir, so I started reading all sorts of memoirs, probably 300. I made a list one time.
Really?
Over several years. And some of them were terrible writing. But what I learned a couple things. I learned that the secret to a memoir, unless the person is really famous, like a celebrity, sports figure, president of the United States, that kind of thing, the key to a successful memoir is what it does to the reader more than what you learn about the writer. Because in every one of those memoirs I read, no matter how good or bad they were, they triggered a memory from my own childhood or my own life that I wouldn't have retrieved if I had not read that book. That's what memoirs do. As you're reading about someone else, you're also bringing to the surface things that are in you, about you. And in the letters and emails I've gotten since the book has been out, they generally tell their own stories. They comment a little bit on mine, but they say mine wasn't quite like yours, and then they go ahead and tell me their stories. I wanted to write when I looked at memoirs, there are some that are kind of grand old man looks back on life. Malcolm Muggeridge wrote a 3-volume. He didn't quite finish it, but he titled it Chronicles of Wasted Time. And he'd seen everything as an old man, and he just kind of put it in perspective. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something that showed an emerging point of view, so that when I'm a kid, I'm a naive kid that lives in a trailer park, but I didn't know any different. I was just a trailer kid. And then when I was in high school, I realized, hey, I can make good grades. I'll just do that. And then became kind of the sassy J.D. Salinger type teenager. And the arrogant, obnoxious kid on a Bible college campus. And I wanted the memoir to somehow convey that spirit, that emerging spirit at various stages. So that's one reason I wrote the whole thing in the present tense, except a few things where I had to go back and talk about my mother's childhood and things like that. But I didn't read that many memoirs that were written in the present tense, and I kept going back and forth. So many times I would go through and change every verb to past tense, and then every verb. It's a way of delaying writing.
Yeah, right.
But I wanted to capture that immediacy and the emerging, because that's what we are. And now that I'm past 70, I am who I am. It's not going to change much from now on. But I can look back and see, but I didn't used to be that way.
Yeah.
So what happened in these various phases to change me? That's part of that exploration we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. That put some things together for me in terms of thinking about your story. Because
not everybody gets that. That's a risk when you present yourself as superior, looking down on these faithful people. Some people are offended by that, and they're going to judge me by that. But that is true to who I was at that time, and it's a risk I take. And if they keep reading, they find I don't stay that way, I hope. But they may not keep reading. They may just drop out. So.
Yeah. But that's an interesting dynamic. This shifting relationship to truth throughout the book, and yet you are trying to tell the truth as a person who is where you are now.
Yes. And of course, the book concludes before some of those stories I told you here, stories, steps toward reconciliation in my own family. It doesn't conclude with a happy scene where we're all together forgiving everything that's ever happened, because it wasn't true. Yeah. It may be true. There are signs that it could go closer to that truth now, but it hasn't happened yet. There have been steps toward it, at least not steps away from it. But my family, like a lot of families, doesn't have one of those happy endings yet.
Yeah. Well, here's hoping that, the story's not done yet. So
you're right. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to wrap up the question I usually wrap up with, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
Make me want to write. Oh, I learned from so many. I wrote about my favorite writers in a book called Soul Survivor. 13 people who I say helped my faith survive the church. And I could just pick those out. I mean, there are classics in there like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. You read those, and at first it's so intimidating trying to keep track of the Russian names in these thick books. And then you get swept up and you find out I've been sitting here unmoving for 3 hours and reading this. Yeah. But more to the point, Frederick Buechner is in that book also. He writes about both fiction and nonfiction, and he writes about his nonfiction using the style of fiction. So I learned a lot from him, his storytelling style. Annie Dillard is in there, just a wonderful master of sentences and paragraphs. She's just got the gift. And Henry Nouwen, because he taught me vulnerability, just put it out there, strip yourself. You can help others when you do that. So those each represent a different kind of perspective on writing, but from each one of them, I've taken something crucial in my own writing.
Yeah. Well, Philip Yancey, your writing has meant a lot to me through the years, and has shaped so many of the ways I think about the world. So thank you for your work, and thank you for being on the Habit Podcast.
Well, it was new to me. I know about the Rabbit Room, and I'd like to know more. And I thank you for what you're doing for writers out there. And it's amazing how many people want to write.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's harder than ever because publishers are more demanding than ever. But in some ways, never in history has there been a time where I can write something today that this evening will be read in Kazakhstan and Cambodia and Japan. And that's true of everybody listening to this podcast. It's just amazing how we have an entree that we've never had before. It's hard to make a living because nobody pays you for that stuff.
Sure.
But you can connect with people in a way that no one in history has been able to do.
Yeah, it's I'm so grateful to have that opportunity open. So anyway, thanks again, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Okay, I appreciate it, Jonathan.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at The Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at The Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.